Welcome the chosen ones. Disappearing without drama is the most hazardous action you can make because quiet with strategy is more powerful than a scream. They didn't hear the door shut behind you. There will be no tantrum, warning, or last speech. Just poof, gone. But here's a twist. You didn't just walk out. You planned your leave like a seasoned filmmaker, putting together the closing scene of a blockbuster narrative twist. The treachery was scripted. Their ego was the camera. And you were the calm, sparkling storm in heels or sneakers, putting it all together while drinking tea like lights, unconcerned about the camera. And let's be honest, some of you deserve an Academy Award, a standing ovation, and a 3-part Netflix documentary for successfully escaping that poisonous circus without breaking a single nail. However, here is where things become more complicated. According to psychologists, individuals do not change until they experience enough suffering or clarity. You had both. Instead of bursting, you picked something even more terrible for your opponents. You planned, prepared, and performed. Your departure was not emotional. It was intelligent. It wasn't loud. It was legendary. So today we're delving into what most people don't witness behind the scenes of your departure. Discipline and deceit. Yep, strategic quiet is important. The mental chess you played while thinking you were still in the game, and how your last move haunts them more than 1,000 confrontations ever could. Buckle up. The chosen one. This is not about survival. It is about spiritual espionage. Let's get to the very honest reasons. Your leaving was not simply clean. It was cosmic-level choreography. And, oh sure, they're still repeating it as if they just left or we were outsmarted. Number one, you did not just walk away. You created a psychological trap that they fell into. You didn't just abandon them. You set up a psychological trap so slick that they had no idea they were walking into it. While they were busy attempting to influence you, you were 2 steps ahead, preparing the whole scene for your leave. They felt they had control, but you were quietly gathering emotional data, noticing trends, and taking mental notes while smiling in their direction. Every lie they said, every change in energy, every phony apology. You witnessed everything and said nothing. This was part of the brilliance. You wanted them to feel comfortable enough to expose their hand. You did not call it out. You let it grow. This was not an emotional choice. You weren't just fatigued. You were focused. You remained calm despite your pain because your thoughts had already begun to plan your path to liberation. You let them believe they still had access to you. You continued to respond to messages, show up when necessary, and play your part just enough to keep suspicion at bay. That's what made it so compelling. They didn't realize you were done. You moved as if you were still involved. However, spiritually, you were already gone. You prepared your leave as if it were a mission. You began establishing limits. They did not notice. You started preparing your next movements in quiet. You did not bang the door. You kept it slightly open because you knew the truth would ultimately come out on its own. That's what made your leaving so poetic. You did not fight for closure. You gave them freedom to show their whole dysfunction while documenting the breakdown and moving like a ghost about to depart. When it eventually occurred, they were astonished. No loud goodbyes or pleading, just a clean cut. By the time they noticed it, you were gone. You had already outgrown the whole thing. Your mental abilities had advanced. Your emotions had caught up. And your spirit has already moved into a new season. They don't comprehend this. Your leaving lasted more than a second. It was a masterpiece, and they're still shocked because they didn't see it coming. You didn't just walk out. You observed, waited, and executed. That was not an escape. That was power in action. And it was perfect. Number two, your departure was not an escape. It was the implementation of a strategic epiphany. Your leave was not just about leaving. It was about ensuring that the tale would not be skewed after you left. You knew precisely what they were going to do when you went away. Span it. Play the victim. Make it seem that you were unstable, resentful, or just bitter. Instead of rushing away, you arranged your leaving as a deliberate, controlled unveiling. You did not need to destroy them. You only wanted to depart in such a clear, deliberate manner that when people looked back, they'd understand why you went without having to explain it. You knew that the truth had a greater effect when it unfolded on its own. So you stopped explaining. You stopped responding to the pandemonium. You grew calmer and more watchful. You started to let their actions speak for themselves while conserving your own energy. You allowed the dysfunction to bubble up until it could no longer be disguised. And you didn't hurry it. You let time work for you. This is what made it so effective. You were not in a rush to run. You were waiting for the proper opportunity to make your absence meaningful. This was not an emotional collapse. It was a quiet buildup to something apparent. You were laying the groundwork for truth. To have the loudest voice, you did not expose them. They revealed themselves. You simply gave them the space to do it. And while they were still underestimating your pain, you were almost halfway out the door, your dignity, receipts, and sense of direction intact. People who had previously been taken in by their charm began to raise questions. People who previously questioned your account of events began to see what you saw. And that's exactly what you wanted. Not to win the debate, but to depart in such a strong, deliberate manner that the facts began to disclose themselves after you left. You did not shatter their mask. You merely walked away, letting the mask go without lifting a finger. What disturbed them was more than simply your absence. It was that you did not have to yell, struggle, or plead. Your absence accomplished what your presence could not. It revealed the reality more clearly than any confrontation could. And that's why they're still plagued by how you left. Because they understand you didn't simply depart. You provided the final proof. Number 3, you were aware they were observing. So you made your breakup into a broadcast. You knew they were watching you, so you made sure your departure was more than simply clean. It was memorable. You transformed it into a performance people couldn't ignore. Every movement you made was deliberate. You weren't just leaving. You were photographing your way out without saying anything. You let them believe they were still in charge. They are still the puppet masters, while you painstakingly reclaimed every aspect of yourself. You made your progress visible enough for people to experience it, but private enough that they never saw the whole picture. That's why it struck so hard. You did not run away. You verbally developed. You left hints in your energy, limits, and quiet. You did not need to argue or explain yourself. Your actions communicated the whole tale, and everyone was paying attentively. Those who were previously perplexed about you began to realize the reality just by seeing how you handled yourself. That was not luck. That was precise. While they felt they still had control over the story, you were developing a whole different one. You ensured that people could connect the dots without you having to spell it out. You did not post rants. You did not cast shade. However, your radiance, tranquility, and level have all improved. It prompted others to ask inquiries. And every time they attempted to talk about you, they sounded more resentful, unstable, and vulnerable. The beauty of your leave was how carefree it seemed. But underneath that serenity was someone who had seen enough mayhem to know not to match their enthusiasm. You wanted them to stay watching, because the more they looked, the clearer it seemed that they were the issue. They expected you to spiral, to return wailing, to plead, but you moved like someone who understood their value and had already outgrown the situation. That's what causes it to burn. You transformed your leaving into a quiet broadcast, a live testament. They were tuned in every day, looking for indications of weakness, but all they saw was strength. You didn't just walk away. You show them what actual power looks like when there is no need to prove anything. They are now unable to unsee it. Number 4, you let them believe they were still winning while you sealed their demise. They believed they were still winning. They assumed they had you just where they wanted you. Confused, weak, dependent, and mute. But you were not frozen. You were focused. You were not lost. You were loading. You made them believe they were still in power because you understood something they never would. Emotional and impetuous. And this gives them power. Strategic stillness removes it. You grinned despite the treachery. Not because you didn't feel it, but because you didn't want to spend a single move responding to a game that you'd already chosen to abandon. You saw through every insult, deception, and effort to press your buttons, yet you kept your calm. You understood that the emotional explosion they were looking for would simply provide them with a narrative to tell. You gave them nothing to twist. You were quiet but not idle. You were documenting every interaction, trend, and double standard. They all became part of the internal archive you were creating, while they believed they were getting away with it. You were becoming wiser, stronger, and clearer. And the more they assumed you were still under their spell, the more they disclosed about themselves. Louder, nastier, sloppier. You did not hurry. You allowed them to completely unveil themselves. You realized that the last move had to be surgical. No mess, no drama. Simply depart with receipts and a renewed feeling of self. By the time you left, you were no longer the same person. You had perfected the skill of blooming out of disorder without drawing attention to it. You turned your agony into accuracy. You gave them the impression that they were in charge until the very end. And when you eventually chopped them off, it was so clean and complete. They did not even have time to defend themselves. That is what broke them. They weren't merely startled when you departed. They were tormented by how you accomplished it. Because, to be honest, they had no idea it was coming. They assumed you were caught up in their drama. Meanwhile, you were cementing their destiny with each silent stride toward your escape. And now they're left to find out how they lost a game they believed they were winning. Number 5, you weaponized their preconceptions and used them as a cover. They thought they had you figured out. They assumed you were too sensitive, fragile, and innocent to ever really walk away. And that's just what you wanted people to think. Their arrogance became your armor. Their assumptions provided the ideal distraction. You let them believe they were the brightest person in the room while silently examining every mistake, slip-up, and weak spot. They believed they had the upper hand, but what they really had was a false feeling of security, one that you purposefully let them retain. You turned your naivete into a costume. You wore bewilderment as a mask. You acted helpless when necessary, not because you were weak, but because you were strategic. You allowed them to undress to meet your intellect, strength, and insight. They assumed you were trapped, overwhelmed, and dependent, but you were really paying attention, gathering emotional data, and developing your escape strategy in plain sight. You did not make an announcement about your progress. You developed in quiet, behind the radar, while others performed. Your quiet was not due to fear. It was set up. You allowed them to dig their own grave, one action at a time. You observed every time they lied. Every time they influenced you, you saw a pattern. You let them believe they were still winning. You remain at the center of your universe, while you were softly removing electricity from every part of the link. They noticed you become quieter. They believed they had broken you. What they didn't comprehend was that you were backing off because you were nearly finished. They had no notion there was a backdoor. No idea that every step they made in their fake supremacy was really bringing you closer to freedom. You were the architect of your escape, and they were too arrogant to see the construction going right in front of their eyes when you eventually walked. It was more than simply a shock to them. It humiliated them because they now had to accept that the person they derided, neglected, or looked down on had thoroughly outmaneuvered them. You did not challenge their preconceptions. You utilized them. And in doing so, you transformed their whole idea of control into the very reason they never saw your power coming. Number 6, you utilized their own narcissism as a diversion. You knew early on that the secret to leaving them was not to address their ego. Technology meant letting technology do the job for you. Their concern with being the center of attention, being adored, applauded, and always correct blinded them to what actually mattered. They didn't pay attention to you. They focused on the mirror. That's why you were able to watch without suspicion. While they were performing, you were filming with your sharpest recollection and clearest inner vision you've ever had, rather than a camera. They were so wrapped up in their own story that they didn't see you withdrawing emotionally. They were too preoccupied with making sure their mask seemed immaculate to the outer world. That egotistical need to look flawless became your cover. You performed your part exactly so to keep their attention on yourselves. You supplemented when necessary. You kept silent when required. You gave them the impression that you were still in the relationship while you were psychologically quitting it gradually. The reality is you didn't need to fool them. They fooled themselves. Their ego required an audience more than they could have anticipated. You were merely applauding to keep the spectacle running while you gathered your courage. You knew they'd never notice your distance since they'd never been properly connected to you to begin with. They were hooked to their own reflection. and you allowed them to remain high on that delusion while you took notes. You learn about their manipulation cycles. You saw their practices of blame shifting, guilt tripping, and gaslighting. You did not interrupt the program. You studied it. You pretended to be the puppeteer while silently slipping out of the strings and standing backstage, waiting for the right time to steal whatever they thought you didn't see. When you eventually departed, they were startled. Not because they adored you, but because they had lost their primary audience. They never imagined you'd have the fortitude to go. That's how deep their hubris went. But you were never really imprisoned. You just waited long enough for them to be deluded by their own ego. You made your discreet, planned leave completely informed, fully prepared, and thoroughly executed. Seventh, you did not destroy any bridges. You let them burn themselves while keeping a safe distance with a matchbook. You didn't need to yell, expose, or drag them through the mud. That isn't your style. You knew the truth was strong enough to make you do things you didn't want to do. So rather of igniting flames, you let them spark their own, again and again, until they found themselves standing in the ashes, perplexed as to how everything had disintegrated. You were never a destroyer. You were just the witness who eventually quit holding the walls up for them. There were no spectacular exits, no burn earth, just a quiet, clean break that left everyone wondering how someone so collected, polite, and consistent could walk away with no ill will. That is what struck the most. You didn't come out swinging. You just departed. In doing so, you left a quiet that screamed more than any confrontation could. People were curious because of the quiet. People began to ask inquiries about them rather than you. You did not have to reveal anything. You just left them alone with the disaster they attempted to hide. The reality began to slip through the gaps as your energy was no longer required to maintain the illusion. Without your presence to soften them, the falsehoods they uttered would fall apart. The story they presented started to crumble the instant you walked beyond the frame. That is what occurs when your honesty is the only thing holding their mask in place. You were not seeking vengeance. You were interested in peace. Walking away without remorse was the retribution, not because it wounded them, but because it forced them to confront all they had projected upon you. You became the mirror they wanted to avoid. And by the time they learned the harm was caused by them rather than you, they had already suffered the consequences of their own actions. You went away with a matchbook? Yes, but you never ignited a flame. They accomplished it all on their own. You just stepped back far enough to avoid being trapped in the flames. And as the smoke rises, people are beginning to understand why you fled. And they are recognizing that you were not the issue. You were the evidence. Number 8, you played long enough to make the withdrawal seem unintentional. They glanced at you and assumed you were done, worn out, emotionally wounded, and maybe too frail to exist without them. And you let them believe that you bought into their illusion. You gave them just enough quiet misery and stillness to convince them that they had finally drained you of all your strength. However, while they were seeing you through the lens of their ego, you were sliding between the gaps. They didn't realize you could fit through. You were not weak. You were sensible. You knew that if you made a lot of noise, they'd work harder to catch you. So you did the reverse. You pretended to be invisible. You stopped resisting, not because you gave up, but because you were saving energy. You led them to believe you had surrendered. But deep down, you were rebuilding in ways that people couldn't see. You were recuperating secretly. You were reclaiming the aspects of yourself that they had attempted to demolish. And they kept laughing, taunting, and being arrogant. You were securing your departure. You didn't give them a spectacular performance. You didn't need a spectacular exit that would have given them an excuse to label you insane, emotional, or unstable. Instead, you made the departure seem like a gentle fade, which they scarcely noticed until you were gone. That was the genius of your approach. You moved silently. You did not proclaim your evolution. You simply stepped right into it. While they were preoccupied with their own self-importance, they realized you were not only physically distant, but also psychologically, spiritually, and emotionally aloof. They attempted to re-engage, agitate, and draw you back into old patterns, but you had already passed the point of no return. You'd healed beyond their axis. They are still trying to find out when you slipped gone. That's the beauty of it. The version of you they believed was broken was the correct version, creating a new life behind the curtain. You didn't just depart. You disappeared on purpose. And now all they have is bewilderment and the harsh awareness that the weakness they perceived was really the plan that set you free. Number 9, you made them believe they rejected you while in reality you were ensuring you'd never have to look back. They believed they had shut you off. They believed they had the final say. They assumed they had dumped you like you were disposable. And that's just what you wanted people to think. You knew their ego couldn't stop feeling strong, even if it meant being the one to walk away. So you set the trap. You delayed your reactions. You retreated just enough to make them believe you were losing interest. You stopped arguing over talks, justifying yourself, and responding to their drama. You offered them stillness, which they mistook for weakness. Perfect. You realized how much they want control. You knew they couldn't keep feeling like they were losing you. So you played your cards wisely. You made them believe they were the ones pulling the plug. You made them feel in control even though you were already halfway out the door, emotionally packed, and mentally moved on. You gave them the impression of authority since it made the actual escape easier. Cleaner, final. They believed you were heartbroken. They predicted you would spiral. They waited for the breakdown, the apologies, and the frantic call. But none arrived since you were already free. You did not want to go back in. You had planned for this moment long before they realized it was coming. You'd already wept. Your final tears shed behind closed doors indicated that you had already confronted the suffering and completed the inner effort. When they returned to see whether they still had a grasp on you, all they discovered was a locked door and a version of you they couldn't identify. They felt they had rejected you, but you were the one who handed them the platform. You knew precisely how they would perform on it. They wanted to feel like the winner. So you gave them a false award, went off the stage, and began a new life without an audience. You were not rejected. Rather, you were unleashed. And that was not a power play. That was your grand strategy. You did not lose the item. You've gained everything. Clarity, healing, and liberation. Most importantly, you learn about yourself. That was the true victory. And they will never have the opportunity to play that game with you again. Number 10, you made your recovery seem so simple. It upset them. They believed that breaking you would be the pinnacle of their narrative. They expected you to remain in that dark place, repeating the trauma, wallowing in self-doubt, and maybe begging to return. They wanted you to lose yourself fully. They envisioned you falling apart for years, hardly functioning, and unable to heal without their affirmation. But what they didn't expect was your fortitude. They miscalculated how much you could bleed and then rise as if nothing had harmed you. They didn't witness the quiet battle you waged through sleepless nights and quivering prayers. Breathing became difficult at times. You weren't just healing. You were constructing from the ground up alone, with no audience or applause. It's just you, your scars, God, and the unwavering will to not remain broken. You were quiet about it. You did not announce each step of your return. You let the process to purify you in private while the world believed you were still broken. Then you emerged calm, grounded, and shining. Not because you wanted to prove anything, but because you were healed. That shine they perceive today isn't from cosmetics or a filter. That is supernatural power masquerading as calm. That is knowledge woven within your tone. That is clarity in your boundaries. Grace in your quiet, strength in your presence. They're outraged because they don't understand it. How could someone they had worked so hard to break become even more powerful? How could they abandon someone? Show up more dazzling, fortunate, and focused than ever. They did not expect to see you thrive. They expected you to drag your feet, bitter, shattered, and yet in pain. But instead, they saw you smiling. It rattled them. The effortlessness really gets under their skin. Because they understand it wasn't easy. They know you gave it your all. That makes your peace even more dangerous. You didn't just survive what they did. You made it seem stunning. And now your healing is louder than theirs. Your light is your vengeance. And your excitement is evidence that their scheme did not just fail. It backfired. A number. You did not just quit a situation. You left a whole psychological blueprint behind. You believed you were just trying to survive, just hoping to make it out intact. But without realizing it, you were a pattern, a silent guidebook for walking away with dignity while everything around you was attempting to cause mayhem. Your leaving was not just for you. It became a signal, a real demonstration that you may walk out of lunacy without matching its fury. People saw that there were others watching, some near, others far away, who had been locked in similar cycles, doubting their sanity, feeling imprisoned, bewildered, and scared to escape. They'd been taught that leaving had to be dramatic, that they ought to reveal everything, face every lie, and demolish the whole home. But then they saw you calm, concentrated, and unshaken. You did not provide a dramatic speech. You didn't make anyone's misery worse. You just walked with purpose, gradually disappearing from the system that was draining you. Your quiet became a plan. Your limit became a lesson. Your departure became evidence. You may not have known it, but your refusal to retaliate was a kind of leadership. You refused to descend to their level. The way you prioritized peace above performance. That caused something to change in the individuals watching from the sidelines. You taught them that sometimes the loudest expression of self-worth is to just depart without explaining. You demonstrated that walking away quietly is not a sign of weakness. It is power. And it's the kind that echoes. You were not required to provide a detailed account. You didn't need a crowd since you chose your own sanity. You made a quiet roadmap. Others might follow. You demonstrated that you don't need to explode to escape. You made a part with a plan. You can triumph without losing your soul. And now, because of how you handled it, someone else realizes they are not trapped. They just wanted to see someone do things differently. You did. And you made it seem not just conceivable, but strong. You transformed emotional assault into a lesson in sovereignty. They believed they had broken you. They believed that the falsehoods, emotional roller coasters, subtle barbs, and incessant shifting of blame would cause you to become confused and forget who you were. But they didn't understand you weren't just surviving it. You were studying it. Every insult, argument, and perplexing interaction was discreetly recorded in your private archive. You were not responding. You were remembering. You were not lost. You were learning. They employed gaslighting to attempt to change your reality. They distorted facts, denied things you knew were real, and forced you to doubt your own beliefs. But gradually you saw the trend. You began to observe how the reality was always shifting to preserve their ego. That insight tripped a switch. You stopped attempting to prove your truth and began to accept your own view. That was your first exercise of sovereignty, choosing the truth above their performance. Then came the triangulation, games involving others, the comparisons, the subtle efforts to make you feel inferior instead of falling for it. You witnessed it. You've seen how they utilized division to keep power. You've quit competing. You disengaged from the drama. And in that dissociation, you regained power. The sabotage, the times when they quietly attempted to make you fail or question yourself, was the ultimate training ground. Instead of internalizing the assaults, you came to see the insecurity that drove their actions. That adjustment in viewpoint altered everything. You stopped personalizing their techniques and instead saw them as indicators of who they really were. That clarity became your armor. You did not just walk away from abuse. You alchemized it. You transformed it into knowing knowledge and emotional intelligence that no book could offer you. You emerged out the other side with greater intuition, firmer boundaries, and an unshakable sense of self. While they believed they were keeping you in a cycle, they were really preparing you for a degree of sovereignty that they would never achieve. You didn't just survive what they did. You've decrypted it. You are now not just free, but also smarter, calmer, and more observant than you have ever been. That is what terrifies me most. You did not come out broken. You turned out amazing. A number. You played stupid long enough to become clever without interruption. They assumed you didn't grasp it. They believed the manipulation was working. That you were too perplexed, emotionally committed, and unsophisticated to see the game for what it was. But you weren't in the fog. You were completely awake. Just silent. You let them believe you were in the dark. Because the delusion provided you the freedom to proceed without opposition. They were laughing behind your back, believing they could get away with anything. You sat in quiet, connecting the dots. They didn't even realize they were on the page. You did not spend time addressing each untruth. You did not fight over every change in their tale. You let them speak and listened carefully, not to their words, but to their energy, patterns, and contradictions. You observed how they became defensive when you questioned them, how they turned your worries into assaults, and how their version of events consistently made them the victim. You were not lost. You were documenting. You were creating a psychological profile. And each paradox helped you gain clarity. They assumed you were stupid since you did not respond. But in actuality, you were too savvy to spend energy on pointless fights. You knew they wanted turmoil. You knew they thrived on uncertainty and emotional reactions. So you calmed them down. You gave them ignorance. You made them feel untouchable and superior. I'm sure you'd never figure it out. That was your shield. Your quiet did not indicate uncertainty. It was cover. Your patience was not a weakness. It was a calculation. You created mental maps. You tracked the exits and observed the cycles. You were not going to remain. You simply didn't want to leave on their terms. You wanted to go with your peace, dignity, and a clear awareness that you'd never fall for that dynamic again. When you ultimately departed, it wasn't an unexpected move. It was the last stage in a process they were unaware had begun. They are still trying to figure out how you did it, how you went from helpless to healed, bewildered to untouchable. But you know the truth. You played stupid long enough to become clever without interruption. And now you see everything clearly, and you will never go back. A number. Your departure was not a farewell. It was a graduation. Your leaving was not a nasty response. It was neither a breakdown nor an emotional urge. It was a breakthrough. You did not storm out. You ascended. You did not run. You rose. What they witnessed as you walked away was you stepping into a version of yourself that couldn't be shrunk to suit the dysfunction. You did not just exit the room. You outgrew the whole building. They called it abandonment, but it was really alignment. You'd remain long enough to learn what you needed to know, see what you needed to see, and experience what you needed to feel. But the lesson was done. You'd finished the spiritual job, and the exam was apparent. Could you move away from something that was cozy yet toxic? Could you graduate without seeking adulation, vengeance, or closure? You did. They did not expect you to pass. In reality, they expected you to be locked in the loop, second-guessing yourself, demonstrating your value, and hoping that things would change. But something in you moved. You stopped waiting. You stopped bargaining with chaos. And you understood that they would not be the ones to bring you healing. It was going to come from within. That knowledge became your permission slip to go. Allow them to express what they want. Allow them to twist the tale. You do not need to correct them since the truth is permanent and obvious in your outcomes. You did not forsake anybody. You simply finished forsaking yourself. You didn't ignore them. You climbed above them. And they didn't see it coming because they were too busy plotting your ruin. They never expected you to craft your own finale. You were never supposed to remain in that chapter forever. You were only a guest star in a plot that was never intended to showcase your full ability. You came, you saw, you grew, and you graduated with your peace intact, your soul enhanced, and your future wide open. That was not a farewell. That was evolution. And no matter how much they attempt to change it, the reality remains. You did not leave the narrative. You have outlived it. They saw your leave as the end. However, it was the beginning of everything they had not anticipated. What seemed to be quiet was really a plan. What seemed to be weakness was divine calculation, while what appeared to be submission was your finest form of self-mastery. You didn't just walk away. You changed the laws for leaving with your crown still on and your soul impenetrable. You did not need to yell. You did not need to retaliate. You didn't need a throng to cheer for you. Your presence had already spoken enough, and your disappearance did the rest. And now you are live evidence that elevation does not need explanation. You fled without revenge, without theatrics, and without sacrificing your essential identity. That is power. That's unusual. And this is why they are still whirling. Because no one taught them that the most elegant departures produce the loudest echoes. So let them chatter. Allow them to rewrite their side of the tale. Allow people to imagine you were the villain. History will reveal what truly transpired, not by their words, but through your own development. The radiance, the artwork, and the intent. The work that does not seek permission. The power that no longer requires validation. You did not just endure the circumstance. You surpassed it. You created the agony, the professor, the confusion, your compass, and the betrayal. Your breakthrough. You are not the same person you were when it began. And thank God for that, because who you are today is unshakable, irrefutable, and impervious to dysfunction and everyone observing. I'm still trying to find the fortitude to walk away. Remember that you don't have to blow yourself up to get away. Sometimes your quietest action yields the loudest win. The chosen one. Your leaving was more than simply a decision. It was your growth in motion. And you walked out of the fire not just whole, but completely. If this message hits you like a truth bomb, don't scroll away. This is your place for real truth, spiritual clarity, and unabashed healing. If you've ever had to walk away from individuals that didn't respect your worth, making a silent departure, it's altered everything. You are not alone. This channel was created for people like you and myself with similar voices and adventures. Please do me a favor. Subscribe to the channel to ensure you never miss a word your spirit needs to hear. I like this video. If it gave you goosebumps, comfort, or courage, leave a remark and let's discuss your growth. Your story matters here. Share this with someone planning their own graceful leave. They should hear this. We are creating a tribe of strong, knowledgeable, spiritually untouchable beings right here. And you're already one of us. Your healing is not silent. It is a movement. Let us rise together. God bless you.